Okay, so all this unit, we have really been talking about the big differences between the Renaissance and the Baroque. So that really is what your project is going to be focusing on. So we're going to talk real quick about this guy named Heinrich Wulffen, and he was one of the first art historians, so one of the first people to study the history of art, which is what we're doing, right? He lived in Switzerland from 1864 to 1945, and he defined the vocabulary of art analysis. He was one of the first people to say, when we're looking at art, this is how we analyze it. He was particularly interested in the differences between the Renaissance and the Baroque, which is what we've really been talking about. So he came up with this thing called the 5 polarities. He identified 5 ways in which the Renaissance and the Baroque were polar opposites. So one here, opposite ends of the spectrum. That's why they are called polarities. He considered Raphael and Rembrandt to be the perfect examples of these periods. So when we talked about Raphael, the School of Athens, we've talked about Rembrandt. So we'll kind of see what he's talking about there. So the first way that they're opposites is linear versus painterly. So the Renaissance art is linear, meaning it's line based and often had strong outlines of figures, where Baroque art is painterly, which means it has a style less concerned with line and more focused on value. So here we have an example. So the Birth of Venus has clearly defined outlines. You can see very distinctly where one thing ends and another begins. You can tell the difference in the trees and the grass and the shirts and the skies. Everything is clearly different. Whereas in Rembrandt's self-portrait, you can see things are not quite as defined. The jacket doesn't have a clear ending. It just kind of fades into the background. The second difference is plane versus recession. Renaissance art subjects often exist on a singular plane, where Baroque art has multiple planes with an identifiable foreground, middle ground, and background. So here's what that looks like. The Last Supper, all the same figures exist together, right? They're all in that straight line. They're all in the same distance away from the viewer. Where when we get to the Baroque, we have people in the background. We have dogs in the front. You can see reflections back here, other paintings going on back here. There is a difference. There's multiple planes of existence. Then the third difference is closed form versus open form. The Renaissance has closed form, meaning it itself is contained. There is often a literal frame, where Baroque art has open form. The subjects might be partially out of view, or the viewer can imagine the scene extending past the frame. Okay, so here we have, in the painting itself, we have the archway that defines what's happening. Everybody is in that frame. You can see them all. Whereas in the Baroque, this is the Garden of Love, you can see people coming in, coming out. I imagine that there's something else happening outside of what we can see. The fourth is multiplicity versus unity. In Renaissance art, each individual subject exists in its own space and is independent. In the Baroque, everything is tied together and depends on each other. So let's see what that means. So in the Annunciation, every part is independent. Okay, people are not overlapping. Each figure has their own kind of segment of the painting. But in Doubting St. Thomas, the Incredulity of St. Thomas, the various figures are united and dependent on one another. They're leaning on one another. You can't tell where one figure ends. They have to exist together, right? So if I'd cut this first painting in half, it would still be a complete painting. You don't know that the other figure has to be there. Whereas in the Baroque painting on the right, every figure's story depends on the other. They wouldn't, like if we separated this person, it wouldn't make sense to just have this person here with a stab wound. Okay. The fifth is absolute clarity versus relative clarity. Renaissance art has absolute clarity, meaning if it has one defined meaning and it is not open to interpretation. Baroque art has relative clarity, meaning it can be experienced in a variety of ways depending on the viewer. Okay, so in the creation of Adam on the Sistine ceiling, this has a definite and identifiable meaning. Okay, so this is God creating Adam. There's no interpretation here. Where in the Baroque, this is Judith beheading Holofernes. It can be experienced in many ways. The viewer may look on it differently depending on who they are. You may look at it as a just action and a murder, depending on your viewpoint. All right, so what are you doing with those 5 polarities? For each of these 5 polarities, you are going to choose a Renaissance artwork and a Baroque artwork that you think represents those. You cannot use the ones that were given in the example. And then you're going to write a very short description about how they show that thing. So just like here, you're like, this is this, this is this. 2 or 3 sentences, okay? So I've given you a slide for each of those differences, and you're going to insert a picture of a Renaissance art that and a Baroque art that each represent that difference, and then type your explanation over here. Okay, so you have 5 of these to do, which means that you will be finding at least 10 pictures. Okay,